Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Lisa Pritchard. Welcome to today's program, The Hour of Trial and Destiny, Black Agency and the Founding of Missouri's First Freedmen Schools by Jefferson College Instructor of History, Joe Thurman. This presentation is part of our year-long commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This programming is supported by PACE, the college's Performing Arts and Cultural Enrichment Series. Many of you may be familiar with Joe Thurman from his popular Jefferson County History Minute series on the college's YouTube page. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to check that out. What you may not know is that Joe has been researching African American educational history with a particular emphasis on the post-Civil War Reconstruction era for over 20 years. Along with the team representing multiple departments across the college, he is currently incorporating this research into what will be a traveling history exhibit entitled Slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction in Jefferson County, Missouri. He hopes with this presentation to bring to light the many contributions of the Black community to the building of Missouri's first freedmen schools. Please join me in welcoming Joe Thurman.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to it. So, as Lisa was mentioning, I'm here to present on Missouri's first freedmen schools. And so, before I get started though, I did want to just mention, because I'm not really going to reference this back, but this photograph you're looking at here actually was one of those schools. It no longer stands. It was out in Warrensburg, and it was known as the Howard School. And at the time I took this photograph, it was still standing, and they were in the process of trying to raise the funds to rehab it, but unfortunately a storm was stronger than the fundraising, and it did collapse. So it is no longer there. But this is kind of a good model to keep in mind as I go through some of this. So kind of just to get us started, I wanted to draw your attention over here to this statue, this very well-known statue in Washington, D.C. So this is known as the Emancipation Memorial. And it has been on that spot in D.C. since 1876. So it was dedicated on April 14th, 1876. So that would have been 11 years to the day that Abraham Lincoln died. And the statue itself was commissioned by the Western Sanitary Commission, which was based out of St. Louis. And they were a Civil War era aid society helping refugees, ex-slaves, things like this. And so they commissioned the statue, and they kind of led the fundraising charge, but the overwhelming majority of the actual money was contributed by emancipated slaves, and many of those ex-slaves were right here in Missouri. And so the work was done, and as they were sculpting this, the individual who is kneeling at Lincoln's feet there, that is actually modeled after a real-life slave from Missouri. His name was Archer Alexander. He was enslaved in St. Charles County. During the war, he managed to escape to St. Louis. His story gets pretty involved. It's really intriguing. But basically, he comes into contact with people who are operating the Western Sanitary Commission. They convince him to sit for pictures that were the model for that portrait. So anyway, that day the dedication is happening. President Ulysses S. Grant is there. There's thousands of spectators have come out. Blanche K. Bruce, who is going to be an individual that's going to factor into our story in a little bit, was there, as was Frederick Douglass. And so Frederick Douglass was invited to speak that day. And as he's addressing the crowd, he's talking about this statue. And one of the things he pointed out is that what this statue, while it celebrates Lincoln and emancipation, what it doesn't do is speak to the role of the Black community in emancipation and in the post-Civil War reconstruction of the country. And that's what he was hoping to bring light to, and that's what I kind of want to speak to today. Certainly there are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of people within the community and outside who play a role, but that's going to kind of be my principal focus. So before we get to the real heart of it, just a couple of things to set us up. With respect to Reconstruction, so the whole idea is 4 years of basically the deadliest war we've ever been involved in. Now we have this period where we have to figure out how to rebuild the country, and a core part of that is building schools for both white and black children. And what happens is, war's over, you get all of these outside groups coming in that each have the laudable goal of educating children in this state, both white and black children in this state. The problem is many of them are so ideologically driven, they have their own idea of what the end game should be that doesn't always mesh with everybody else. So it kind of leads us into this very cyclical process where we'll take a couple of steps forward, we're taking a couple of steps back. It becomes a process of fits and starts. It never moves in this sort of nice linear fashion, like the war's over, we need schools, let's build them. It's stepping forward and stepping back. A lot of great opportunities are taken advantage of, and a lot of them are lost. At the end of the day, when Reconstruction's over, all of those groups, they're gone. They have either been disbanded, they've lost funding, or they've moved on to something else. The one group that was there before, during, and after the war through this process were the enslaved in Missouri. They were the core driver of the permanent change, and that's where we're going to kind of look at these all in conjunction with one another. I tried to minimize the words up here. I couldn't avoid it with this though. This is just what I wanted to do in terms of kind of setting the tone for post-war. We need to think about what, from a legal perspective, education looked like prior to the war. And the first law that we have in Missouri, specifically with respect to the education of the enslaved, comes from the French, and it's just basically a one-line law that says the enslaved in the Louisiana Territory must be taught the basic tenets of Catholicism. That was it. That was the basic principle. Stays that way. We become a state in the early 1820s, and then the next kind of level up in this respect is there's another law passed that says enslaved and free black servants and apprentices cannot be taught to read or write. Then in the 1830s, you get the beginnings of what is like the organized abolitionist movement. And as such, you're getting all these abolitionist organizations coming out. They're printing pamphlets and things, mailing them into the South. That's why we get this law in 1837, which I've excerpted here, basically saying you cannot publish or read or spread abolitionist doctrines in Missouri. But the real milestone, negative milestone event comes in 1847. That's the moment that the law is finally passed, largely out of fear of that abolitionist literature that says you cannot teach any enslaved black or free black to read or to write. If you do, it's a $500 fine and 6 months in jail. The law is not uniformly enforced. There are ways to circumvent it, and that is where this gentleman comes in. So John Barry Meacham, and I apologize for the kind of grainy resolution there. It's the only photograph or illustration I can find of him. But John Barry Meacham was not actually born in Missouri. He was born enslaved in Virginia, and then he was actually, as a young man, he's trained as a carpenter, and so that's going to be 19th century. It's going to be a skill in high demand. And he eventually is able to earn enough to purchase his own freedom. He purchases his father's freedom. They move to Kentucky, and that is where he meets this young enslaved girl, Mary, who will go on to become Mary Meacham. They do get married, and she's still enslaved though, and her enslaver wants to come to St. Louis, and this late 18 teens is when this is happening. And he brings her to St. Louis, and John follows, obviously, because they're married. He becomes a minister. He helps found the first African Baptist church in Missouri, in St. Louis. And with the help of a couple of white northern missionaries, he starts a Sunday school in that church. And rumor is he wasn't just teaching religion there. Well, along comes that 1847 law, and he puts those carpentry skills to work and rehabs. Some stories will tell you he bought it. Some will say he built it from scratch. I'm walking the middle road and saying he bought it and rehabbed it, but he got a steamboat, put a library on it, put desks in it, and anchored it in the middle of the Mississippi River because you're not subject to Missouri law at that point. That was his famous floating freedom school. The boats that are in that image are not it. You don't know how much I wish they were, but they are not. That is just an image looking from Illinois side into downtown St. Louis right about that time that law was passed. So it just kind of gives you a visual of what that would look like. Some other pre-war schools that were getting started. The gentleman on the right there, that is Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels earned several distinctions throughout the mid-19th century. One of those is because he is also operating a, quote, Sunday school where he's also teaching some other things. He later recalled, and I don't know exactly when, but sometime after the war, he admitted to having been arrested for running that school. He did shut it down, but after the war, he goes to Mississippi and has the distinction of becoming the first African American elected to the U.S. Senate, although he does not finish that term. Blanche K. Bruce, who you see on the left there, he and a reverend up near Hannibal, Missouri, ran a school. The record on it, that is pretty scant. It's very difficult to say exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in the vicinity of Hannibal. They ran that school for a short time before the war. Blanche K. Bruce went on to become the second African-American elected to the U.S. Senate. He did serve a full term. He's the one I mentioned that was at that dedication of the Emancipation Memorial. So some other individuals who were involved outside of the black community, because there are a lot of others contributing to this as well. Mary Easton Sibley on the right there, she and her husband owned a farm out in St. Charles, an estate that they called Linden Wood. I think you know where that's going. She helps found Linden Wood University. But in her own words, she said education is the great equalizer. And so she started we're starting to see a pattern here. She starts a Sunday school and is teaching black and white children at that Sunday school. Marian College in Palmyra, not too far outside of Hannibal. The college was started there by abolitionists from Illinois, and they were running a school for a time. Frederick Starr here on the left, he actually was an abolitionist, also out of state, went out to Weston, Missouri to start a church and was living in the home of a slave owner out there. And that slave owner asked him to start teaching his kids Sunday school. And then he started allowing some of his enslaved to be taught as well. That school ran for a couple of years. In St. Louis, Sisters of St. Joseph, Sisters of Mercy, they ran schools very briefly in the 1850s. Archbishop Kenrick, who was a slave owner, allowed for those schools. It wasn't until the mayor started kind of pushing back that those were shut down. But that's the same Sisters of St. Joseph that later started Fatban. So that's kind of the same lineage there. Last couple of things before we get to the war. I did want to mention, with respect to education in general, especially with respect to someone like myself, I tend to kind of think very limited in terms of education. It happens within the four walls of a classroom. But when you start thinking of more broadly about education, we're educated everywhere we really go, and the same was true for the enslaved. There were other ways that they would have received bits and pieces of education. And there was a study done many years ago about this region that's highlighted here that's called Little Dixie. So Little Dixie, when you look at where the slave population was dispersed through the state, there's two places where it was the heaviest, right along the Mississippi River, down into the Boot Heel, down near Cape Girardeau, and then along the Missouri River. And that area along the Missouri River, that was nicknamed Little Dixie. And so this study looked at some of the ways that the enslaved there could have received an education. And it was through things like, they're running farms up there and they're learning those skills. Hiring out was a common practice in Missouri because, relatively speaking, the enslaved population here was small compared to Virginia. Here in Missouri, by the end of the war, slaves here about 115,000. which is significant, but you compare it to somewhere like Virginia, and there's a stark contrast. So a lot of slave owners would hire out their labor to their neighbors, and to be hired out, you would have to have some sort of typically household management skills, sewing, mending, running a household economy. You had to learn how to do these things. Religion was another common way, even outside of Sunday school. And sometimes it was used to teach the tenets of religion. Sometimes religion was used to reinforce the idea that slavery is a benefit, right? It's used as a kind of justification. And then, of course, within the families themselves, there's a lot of that. So let's get to the war. Let's get to the freedmen schools. So when the war starts in 61, African Americans are not allowed to enlist. That is only going to come gradually as Lincoln and most especially people around him convince him that's a shrewd wartime move, because you're going to really increase the number of soldiers at your disposal. And what else you're doing is you're robbing the South of their main labor supply in doing that. So here in Missouri, 1863 is when they can start enlisting. There were 7 regiments of soldiers that came out of Missouri. There will be more that will go elsewhere and enlist. Most of them mustered at Benton Barracks. So Benton Barracks is not there anymore. It would have been on the northern fringes of, I'm not positive, but I feel like Benton Barracks is part of what became Fairgrounds Park in that kind of area. That's where most of them would have been mustered in. And the picture, the photograph you're looking at there on the right actually is one of those soldiers. That picture was taken at Benton Barracks, which is, I think, pretty telling. It's a pretty cool photograph, I think. 2 of those regiments, the 62nd and the 65th, they were fighting down in Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. At the end of the war, they were in Texas. And while they're in Texas, it's very clear the war's almost over. And a discussion was kind of struck by some of the leaders of their regiment. There was a Richard Baxter Foster, who was an abolitionist from back east, and he starts talking to him about this post-war world and the possibility of getting an education. And so these soldiers, they start passing the hat. And they contributed, between those 2 regiments, almost $6,000 of their own money, in addition to an additional 1,000 or so from their commanding officers that went to the beginnings of Lincoln Institute. That is a postcard of Lincoln Institute from about 1904, 1905, so it didn't look like this. The original building that they started with was deemed at the time uninhabitable by humans. It was that poor, but that's all they had. So this is what will eventually morph into Lincoln University that's out there now. It's going to take a while. And the idea is they just wanted a dedicated place centrally located in the state where their children could, and themselves could, receive an education. One member of the 65th Regiment, Samuel Sexton, he alone donated $100. His weekly salary was $13. And he ponied up $100 to go to that school. So we're not done with him yet. We'll circle back. Is my clicker not working? Okay, here we go. So I wanted to speak for just a moment, and I'm going to throw a graph up here in a minute. Please don't everybody run for the exits. There's no better way to display this. But I wanted to speak for a moment to these organizations I was talking about before that were coming in from outside the state. This is some of the bigger ones. There were certainly more than this, but like the American Missionary Association, they were non-denominational abolitionists who, if you're familiar with the Amistad and the slave rebellion on the Amistad, they formed in the years right after that, kind of in response to that. They're going to be some of the first they were actually in Missouri before the war started. Once the war starts, about midway through, they started the first school in St. Louis at the old Missouri Hotel, which is not there anymore. And that had become kind of a gathering place for refugee slaves that were escaping the South. And they're like, there's more and more coming in every day. Let's start a school. So they did. It was already overcrowded. So they get permission from the local provost marshal to find somewhere else. And there was a church at the time called the Ebenezer Church, and they rented that out. 3 days later, it was a pile of ash because somebody found out about the school and they burned it down. So they were back to the Missouri Hotel. They started schools in Jefferson City, Columbia, out in Jackson County, Kansas City, and they were writing letters. And there's an Amistad Center at Tulane University in New Orleans that has all of their archives. And you go through the letters, and all of these teachers they had in the field were basically they are built around the same thing. We would love to start these schools, but we're scared to death for our life. We have no idea what's going to happen if we try to do this. So it's right in the heart of Little Dixie. It was very dangerous territory. Iowa Yearly Meeting, that's Quakers coming out of Iowa. Large number of them. They were one of the most prominent groups here in Missouri. The Freedmen's Aid Commission, they don't last long. They're a collection of a whole bunch of other organizations that can't really seem to get along with one another. And then the Freedmen's Bureau, which we'll get to later, that's the government. That's the government's branch of this operation. So, but one of the interesting things I've found in doing all of this is, if you go back and look at the stories that were being told, it's like for generations, it's, hey, the war's over. All of these northern teachers are coming down to Missouri in the South, and they're going to swoop in and save the day with these schools. This is the myth of the Yankee school marm. Well, there was a study done a few years ago that kind of turned that on its head. And so I collected the data on all of the teachers just in Missouri that we can confirm taught at schools in Missouri and where they were from. And that's where I've got two charts in here. This is the first one. But and it's kind of small, but if you look here, the only two states on that list that would be considered New England would be New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and they sent a total of 2 teachers. Missouri topped the list at 49, and then 44 Iowa, that's the Quakers. And this is both black and white teachers. So this is both groups coming together to teach. You can see it is a lot of outsiders, it's a lot of northerners, but Missouri, most of those that have been confirmed as having taught here were from Missouri and were trained to teach here. So it kind of just blows that whole myth out of the water that it took outsiders to come in to do it. So more words, you don't have to read all that, but I wanted to show you where I plagiarized the title of my presentation from. So same year the AMA gets here, they come in and they're like, what we need to do is we need to form what they called the St. Louis Board of Education for Free Colored Schools. And what they're going to do is they're going to identify a small group of local African-American community leaders, and they're going to put them in charge of this board. The AMA will help fund the schools, but this group is tasked with the day-to-day operations. And as that's happening, they actually wrote a constitution, and in that constitution, they had this passage that beautifully encapsulates what this whole story is about. As you get through it, basically they're talking about the Civil War is ending slavery, right? This is great. It's breaking the shackles of slavery, but now we're entering this new era, this hour of trial and destiny for the ages. And that's the community itself saying, look, we've got this amazing opportunity, this unprecedented opportunity, but we're also very much aware there are going to be a lot of challenges, and they're very aware of this from the start. This is my other chart. I will just leave it here. By the way, I should probably mention this. That is J.F. Bolden. He was one of the members of the board. This is Jordan Early, who was another member. All I did here was kind of lay out the names for you here, because this will be available on video later if you want to go back and have some research fun with your friends. I have spent a fair amount of time trying to track down what I can on them. I can confirm those were their roles within the organization and their professions. You'll notice there is a theme there. There's a lot of reverends, a lot of close connections to local churches. William Preston Brooks, he was a reverend, but he was also a bank president, because the Freedmen's Bureau also started the Freedmen's Savings Bank. And so it was also headquartered out of D.C., but they had a branch in St. Louis, and he was the president of that branch. You can actually go back and see the records of where everybody opened their account, and he has signed each of those. That's, for somebody like me, that's pretty cool. Again, more words you don't have to read, but it's a great ad. So emancipation comes January the 11th of 65. Depending upon who you ask, we were either the first or the second state to emancipate. The only state that likely could have beaten us was Maryland, and it kind of depends on where you're drawing the line there. But we were one of the first to emancipate. Right after emancipation, Thomas Fletcher from Jefferson County, who's governor at that point, drafts this incredible declaration proclaiming this as the day of emancipation. And then they set to work drafting this new Constitution. That's the one that says we got to have public schools for everybody. And that's where things kind of, the great opportunity, but we don't really hit the pause button to ask ourselves, how is this going to work? We just kind of jump in. What also gets lost in all of this is before that Constitution's even drafted, we have written records from all of these locations and probably more where the local black community had already started raising their own money. Oftentimes, they will not reach out to the federal government for assistance unless they run out of funds. They will start the fundraising in their own community. Every one of these locations, another one, as I'm looking at the list, I realize I left off Farmington. Farmington also, every one of those locations, they had raised funds, they were already building schools, and usually it ended up where it ended up costing more than they had anticipated. They'll reach out to the Bureau or some other agency for help. But it really starts there, and that kind of begs the question, well, how are you organizing to raise this money? And one of the favorite ways of doing it was with these Freedmen's fairs. So this ad that I put up here, this is actually communities in Kirkwood and Carondelet both come together, and that's in 1868. And this was a very successful fair. They wanted money to build churches and schools, one building, two functions in both places. And I don't know if the one in Kirkwood was ever built. The one in Carondelet was. And that is it. After a fire, the month after it was built, left it as a shell. So Carondelet is a place where once they started a school there was a young girl. She was in her mid-20s. Anna Cottrell was her name, and she was from Massachusetts, I think, but she came in with the AMA, and a lot of these local families that wanted their kids educated couldn't afford to pay the teachers, so they would let them live with them. And she lived with a local black family in Carondelet, and she starts writing these letters about what it's like to go to school every day. And she's talking about having stones thrown at her and going in and trying to teach class, and people will come in and drag her out. We even have one account of a teacher in St. Louis at another school just outside of Carondelet that was actually taken out and thrown in the river. And I don't know if they actually were able to save her or not. But there were pockets in St. Louis where support for these schools was very strong, and there were places where you're risking your life. One of the other really big problems I would make note of is enumeration. So the law says in 65, if you have a local school district with at least 20 black children in it, you have to start a school. Enumeration, right? But you've only got one superintendent of education. They're headquartered in Jeff City. They cannot travel the whole state checking in on this. So local communities, when they submit their reports, are just saying, well, we don't have 20 kids. We don't have 20 kids. So the Freedmen's Bureau starts sending people out to investigate, and they're like, you have 20 kids. You have more than 20 kids. And so lawmakers in Jeff City said, well, we've got to reduce the number. And so they reduced it to 12. But it kept being an issue because it was so easy, depending on where you were in the state, to just circumvent it. And they did it with great ease. This is a map of my own design. It's not the fanciest, but what I did was kind of tried to highlight in yellow for you where many of the reported examples of violence and fires and things happened. And again, if you were to do an overlay, that compared where the biggest populations of ex-slaves were versus where the violence is happening, you'll see there's a real correlation there. But like down in Cape, if you're familiar with that area, there's just north of the town, there's an old settlement. It's not there anymore. It's called Lovejoy. It was named after Elijah Lovejoy. And a Quaker had come down and started a school there and had gotten the local community to help build it. And within about a week, he wrote his bosses in Iowa that he had already been drug out and beaten. And then about a week later, they said, stop doing what you're doing. He didn't, so they burned that school down. There was a fire out in Troy. In Linneus, Missouri, there was a very interesting case where the local population tried to get the teacher run out of town by claiming that she was having an inappropriate relationship with another member of the local school board or something. It was all made up. They were just trying to fabricate a scandal. And I mean, there were newspaper articles talking about this, and that almost got her run out of town. So, so that's kind of that. Some other issues that will be encountered. Finances are always a problem. That's one of the things, one of the obstacles the Bureau is really facing a lot of is they are a government organization, but there's only so much money to go around because Missouri's not the only state where you're trying to build schools. And they can't actually build them. All they can do is help fund them. So the Freedmen's Bureau's got financial issues. All of the organizations do. And I got to thinking, what do the financial records of these organizations look like? And for example, I drugged my lovely wife and son to Oskaloosa, Iowa one time, which it's a beautiful town. I didn't even know such a place existed, but I drugged them up there and started sifting through all these records, and I found their treasurer's reports because they had a Freedmen's Commission, and it showed the donations from Missouri. And it said general Missouri population had donated like $47 and some odd cents. And then it says black population had donated almost $760. And so the problem was there were plenty of people outside the black community that wanted to support the schools, but the problem is the risk you're taking in showing public support for them. So those you might see outside. It may not be a direct financial contribution. Sometimes it may be a donation of land or something like that. And then, we kind of reached the point near the end of Reconstruction where these organizations have lost interest. Like the AMA, we're getting to the beginning of the era where farther out west, they're starting to build boarding schools for Native Americans, and the AMA is losing a lot of interest in what's going on here. They're shifting their focus out there. The Bureau is broken up. It's just splintered, and it will no longer exist. Iowa Yearly Meeting, they keep schools here, a handful, in some of the larger populated areas for maybe until about 1885, and then those are all done. Facilities throughout all of this will be absolutely horrible. So kind of to move on into the last leg of this and to bring it back where I started, one of the other major obstacles in all of this is a want of teachers. And there's several ways you can come at this. With respect to white teachers, the pay was better in other schools, so you don't have the financial incentive. And then there's obviously the risk of violence should you teach at them. And more parents within the black community wanted trained black teachers for their schools, but there's no dedicated normal school for that process yet. So in 1870, James Milton Turner, who you see pictured there, and dozens of other representatives from across the state, they met in Jeff City, and they drafted a resolution and said, we need a normal school, a state normal school for the training of black teachers. They actually met, a small group of them met with our new governor, McClurg at the time, and they had an audience with him, and they petitioned him for their cause. And they did not immediately become a state normal school, but the state paid them, I want to say like $5,000. And then shortly after that, they did become a state normal school. And that all happens at the behest of the individuals who showed up at this this meeting, and one of the more astounding things is the average age of the delegates that weren't even 30 years old yet. The majority of the people who I could verify were in their early to mid-20s. And so these are very young, eager kind of representatives of counties from across the state. And they really, what they did was they ran ads in papers across the state. Look, we're looking for delegates to send to this thing. They had a really impressive response. And so before you know it, Lincoln University is on its way to becoming Lincoln University and a state normal school. So as the end of Reconstruction draws near, there's going to be a couple of fundamental changes that are going to happen that are going to redirect all of this. So to this point, we've had 10, 12 years of Reconstruction. Things seem to be going relatively well because it's not just about education. You know, there's other changes that are happening with respect to the vote and things like this. But 1875, we're going to draft another constitution. So now we're up to our third, and that one still supported schools, but there was one slight change that they were sure to specify. Those schools must be separate schools. And that's what opens the door to the founding of Sumner High School, because there was no high school for black children in Missouri at the time. And they said, well, if we're going to have a constitution that requires separate schools, we have to have a separate high school. And Sumner was originally right in the heart of downtown St. Louis. Its present location in the Ville is its third location. The history of that school, you could write volumes on, and I'm actually going to circle back to that in just a moment. The reason it kept getting moved was because the black community kept petitioning and saying, we cannot function as a school in this building. We've got to move, we've got to move. And that's how you end up with the building you have now. I'll circle back to Sumner in a minute. A couple of years later, 1877, that's the year that we normally say, okay, Reconstruction is over. So what's going to happen in St. Louis is really a couple of things. One, the Colored Education Council is going to be founded. This is Francis Roberson, a local businessman who owned a Turkish bath in St. Louis. He had been free even before the war. People loved his Turkish bath. I've seen a few ads for it, nothing that I could really put up here because it gets all blurry on me, but he was very, very well known. He had two sons that will go to Lincoln University and will go on to become architects. So very well-known family. He's one of the members of that council. Same year, what was happening by the 1870s was to teach in Missouri in the public schools, you had to go to a state teachers institute every so often to, hone your skills. Black teachers weren't allowed to do that. So they said in 1877, well, we'll just start our own organization. And they did. They started holding their own teachers institutes in Jeff City at the same time that the other ones were going on. So we're to the point where Reconstruction is quickly slipping away, and you've got the foundation for these schools, but at any moment, so much of that could still slip away. So I want to take us back to where I started. So the dedication of that statue how am I doing on time? If you don't mind my asking.
22.
Okay, because I feel like I've been punishing you all for about an hour already. So to kind of start putting wraps on this, so going back to 1876, that statue, that Emancipation Memorial was dedicated in April. The next month, the Centennial celebration opened in Philadelphia. And every state had their own building there. And this is the Missouri building. And as they're putting this celebration together, they reached out to every state. It's kind of like a World's Fair, put your best foot forward. And that's going to include education. And so you can go through the St. Louis public school records and find they still have the actual exhibits that were up there. And so come to find out, Lincoln University now, the school that was founded by those soldiers at the end of the war, had put together their own book. It's about 700 pages long. There's but one copy of this, and I discovered years ago it exists And I thought, well, I'll contact Lincoln and they will gloriously, through interlibrary loans, send me this book because they know and love me. And they're like, we don't have that because there was a fire that destroyed it. So that there was 2, now we're down to 1. And I tracked it down. It's at Emory University, and I reached out to Emory University, and they put me in touch with an unsuspecting graduate student, and I said, hey, how would you love to digitize this book for me? And they did. And I have a digitized copy of the whole thing. This is the greatest treasure I've ever uncovered as a historian, because those pages are filled with the history of the school and actual student work. I've looked high and low for this, and I thought I would share a couple of pages. So these are photographs that were in there. This was a recently built building. That's faculty and students out on the lawn. This is what would have been hanging on the wall in the building. And then you get into the book itself, and I was like, I work with a lot of different disciplines here at Jefferson College. I don't want to upset anybody, but I don't want to bring in tons of pictures, so don't take offense if your discipline is not up here. But so here's exercises in mental philosophy, in rhetoric, and I know this may be a little hard to read, but the beautiful thing is, at the start of every discipline, you'd have the teacher laying out what the lesson was, and then examples of student work. And at the very bottom, like on the one on the right, what has been written there is the student confirming, this is my work. I promise nobody helped me with this. Here's some math and some grammar. But the best part of the book was art class, because all of their original artwork is still in it. Unfortunately, it's not full color, but it's page after page of this incredible student artwork. So these are some of the schools, the public schools from St. Louis, the black schools in St. Louis, that had also sent in pictures. I have more than what I put in here, but this one was in St. Louis, this one's in St. Louis, and you really can't tell from my photo here, but this sheet of paper up here would list out the disciplines. What are the kids studying, the subjects that they're studying. That's a shot of a school out in St. Joseph, Missouri. So where does all this leave us? I kind of started by saying it's all, you've got, when you think about Reconstruction and this very long process of getting schools started where none had existed for white or black children in a public school sense, it's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, a lot of moving parts. A lot went right, a lot went wrong, but the idea is that kind of through line of black agency and thinking about what's the lingering impact of that. And the 2 major lingering permanent impacts are Sumner High School, which of course still exists, and Lincoln University. And I thought I wanted to speak to that for just a moment in closing. One last note about the schools in St. Louis before I get to them though. Up until 1890, black schools in St. Louis were not allowed to have names. They were called Colored School Number 1, Colored School Number 2, Number 3, and so forth. The black residents of St. Louis petitioned and said that's got to change. And in 1890, they finally got that change, and they were named after, there was a Crispus Attucks, who was one of the victims of the Boston Massacre. And there was I cannot believe I'm drawing a blank on this. You all know where I'm going with it though. But let's think about Lincoln University for a minute. They have the number of graduates who have gone on to just unbelievable careers is astounding. Some of their names are household names, some not so much, like John A. Langford. John A. Langford was born a slave in Potosi, Missouri, ends up going to Lincoln University. He's trained as an architect, moves to Washington, D.C. He's considered the dean of black architects, designed an entire black community in Washington, D.C. There's a church that still stands in Potosi that he designed. He would absolutely remarkable. Monty Taylor, who you see pictured here, he's a chemist. He worked on the Manhattan Project that designed the atomic bomb. He was working out of a laboratory in Chicago. He wrote what was in the 1960s and 70s considered the preeminent chemistry textbook as well. Schools across the country used it well into the 1980s. Lloyd Gaines, who will become very famous for his civil rights activism in Columbia against the University of Missouri and the law school there that he ultimately helps drive the creation of, which will be a branch of Lincoln University. Wendell Pruitt, Richard Pullman, and probably several other names I could have put up there. They all were graduates who also served as part of the Tuskegee Airmen. Wendell Pruitt is the Pruitt in Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. Pruitt and Pullman also went to Sumner High School. Sumner High School, I have not finished my count yet, but I've identified at least 13 different graduates from that school that were in the Tuskegee Airmen. So it's absolutely remarkable. Tina Turner graduated from Sumner High School. Just the list is just, I'm sorry?
Dick Gregory.
That's who I was, yeah, the actor and comedian Dick Gregory graduated from there. Chuck Berry graduated from Sumner High School. It's still an operational high school. Unfortunately, I think they are struggling a bit these days, but they're getting creative in the ways that they can keep that school open. So it's quite a historic place. So to kind of again go back to where I started, that idea that Emancipation Memorial really did not lend itself to the importance of the black role in starting these schools and Reconstruction. Well, at Lincoln University in 2007, they dedicated a statue to kind of change that. And this is the statue. It is, and again, the contrast is not the greatest, but the platform you see back there has members of the 62nd and 65th Colored Infantry atop it, and off to the side, what you can't really see is there's soldiers standing down there, and they're bending over, pulling them up, and out here in the foreground, you have other soldiers that are making their way to that statue. So that was undertaken as to kind of speak to make sure we're kind of getting both halves of that story. That's a lot of talking and a lot of information, but I am done, and I thank you so much for coming out. And I'm happy, if anybody has any questions, I am happy to entertain them. Yes, ma'am.
Did Emory make that book available through the Amistad Center, the digital copy that they made for you?
They did not. The AMA stuff is what I got through Amistad. With Emory, the only way we could make it work was a graduate student, and for a nominal fee that I paid to her, she went to their library and spent 2 days photographing every page in it, and I have it on a jump drive. I've got it saved in about 30 places. Actually, I keep a copy in my safe. So my wife thinks I'm a little bit off the beaten path with it, I think. But yeah, it was just the most, because the one thing you don't often get to see is like examples of what these kids were doing. And when I saw it, I thought, you've got to be kidding me. So someday I'm going to find a way to I need to learn more about like how technology works to maybe put it in a more permanent kind of form that because I'd be happy to give them a copy. I'd even give Jefferson College a copy. Yeah, because I emailed them and I told them, hey, guess what I found? So I'm sure, but they're so busy out there with things. But I have been in communication with them about seeing what I can do to get them a copy of it. So yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned a lot of males that went to black males that went to university, school as where it started. What about black females? Did they equally participate?
That is a great question, and the short answer is yes. And in that book that I was talking about, I have a lot of examples of their work. The problem is I have their names, but tracking where they went afterwards or where they came from before is often very difficult. I do know there were 2 or 3 young ladies who were in that book that went on to become teachers. I know that for sure. One of them went on to become a writer and a poet, not of national renown, and I apologize, it's a lot of names to remember, but I found an example of one of her poems that had been published in a St. Louis newspaper. So the record, they were there, the record out there on, with respect to females is a little more scattered, at least as far as I can tell so far. But that's one of those threads I just kind of keep pulling at. And hopefully I'll uncover something like that, that book, that will help me better answer that questions. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, and, you explained a lot about the violence that happened, right? But then I found it interesting that one of those on the colored council was the president of the bank, okay? So I'm guessing that was a colored bank.
Yes, yeah, it was the Freedmen's Bank, yeah.
But I would assume that bank would be under violence as well. I mean, if they know there's a bank that's taking money, they'd be getting robbed all the time, or...
Yeah, I've never uncovered examples of direct violence towards it, and that may have been in part because of the fact that almost from the start, they were on shaky financial ground the whole time. So it may have been a case where it was just never really perceived as much of a threat in that respect, not like a school is. Had that bank continued to operate, might have been a different story, but the Freedmen's Bureau was more or less gone by about 1872, and the bank right after that was pretty much defunct. So yeah, it's a good question though. Any other questions? How did I get so brilliant? How old am I? Yes, sir.
How long did the floating Freedmen's School stay in operation?
Apparently for a few years, I think. The difficulty is, again, when you have somebody that's openly breaking the law, they're not like writing it down like I wish they would. But James Milton Turner, he later recalled that he was a student in that school, which would mean it probably would have had to have been around for at least 2 or 3 years. And I should have mentioned, he actually went on to become minister to Liberia. So he goes on to great prominence as well. Actually, President Grant appointed him to that position. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but it seems like it was around for at least a couple of years. Well, yes, sir?
Is Lincoln University struggling like all the other HBCUs, like media?
I think Lincoln University at this point is more or less under state control at this point. So I know it's comparatively speaking, it's a relatively small school, but it continues to have a really strong reputation, and I think it continues to attract a strong core of students that are very much keeping it going and helping it to thrive insofar as that's possible with all the changes that are going on. So it is, but it was never really a huge school to begin with. It was always kind of relatively speaking, not giant. Like it's not like a Howard University or anything like that. So another astute and insightful question, sir. So yeah, any other questions?
One more.
Yes,
about,
please.
Your current project on slavery in Jefferson County. Want to give us a little highlight of what's to come, or anything that you
I would absolutely love
in
to.
your research?
I would love to. So in relation to what I was just talking about, I have researched the first schools to appear in Jefferson County, and the good and bad thing is we've got yearly public school reports. After the first couple of years, they don't give a lot of detail, but I can tell you as early as 1866, those first reports, the local school coordinator, director, board wrote out full text explanations of what was going on. So I know for a fact there were at least 2 schools somewhere in this county as early as 1866. And in Kimmswick, there is a private residence now that if you look at it, there's a plaque on the front of the residence that you can see the house was kind of added on to a smaller building, and that was a school. That one's a little bit more recent. That one was started in the 1880s, but they have a marker up there. With respect to the research that's going into the traveling history exhibit, that is focusing, that will talk about kind of the Reconstruction era, but it won't just be exclusive to education. So what we've been doing is we have identified, we've gone back through all like the slave schedules and everything. We've identified a small group of the largest enslavers in Jefferson County. And what we have found is there's a lot of close relationships, business and otherwise, between them. So we're going to be telling some of their stories, but we're also telling the story kind of like I've tried to do from here, from multiple perspectives. as far as what was happening with respect to slavery in general, within the enslaved community, and then outside. Because we do have, like in the 1930s, the federal government sent photographers out across the country to take photographs of historic buildings. And so we have photographs, government photographs of slave cabins. It was housed under the WPA, but there's a couple of photographs of slave cabins we have, and then the castle at Selma, down outside of Festus, the Ferdinand Kennett family. There's a whole slew of those photographs.
We have those files.
Yes, you do. And we will be paying you a visit very soon. And then with respect to the Civil War, where that is right now is we've been going through prisoner of war records, because here next door in St. Louis, they recorded whenever they took in a prisoner, they noted their home county. And we're finding civilians who lived in Jefferson County that were imprisoned where the Purina Farms plant is, the business's office. There was a prison there, and over in Alton. And they tell you what happened, and a lot of them they would be released if they would swear an oath. And so we're finding copies of the oaths that they took, and they would either be, a lot of them were marked civilians, a lot of them were marked guerrillas. And I had one of those, I hate this term, but aha moments, where I noticed like 3 in a row they were all listed as guerrillas, and they all had the same last name. And so I just started plugging that into a keyword search in the newspaper, and there they popped up. And it was an individual from here in the county who was here when the Union Army came in and captured them. And it's a whole article talking about where they were, what the capture was like, taking them to the prison. But at the same time, I was just out in Columbia and found a collection of letters from a family in DeSoto. And they were strong Unionists. And this guy is writing letters during the war to his daughter Eliza. And I found this one letter where he was talking about telling her to be careful how she behaved, not to hang her out with this rebel faction and all this. And at the very end, you can see where he picked up a pencil and just scribbled in this last little note where apparently the Confederate Army was in DeSoto, and they were basically hightailing it out of there, getting their things together. And he wrote her like this last second note. So again, we're trying to tell the story from as many angles as possible. And, because there wasn't a ton of actual fighting in Jefferson County. So we're kind of telling the war as it came to the county, and then we're telling the story of the war of people from the county who went elsewhere to be part of the war. And then we'll kind of tie it all up with Reconstruction. And it's going to be, it's a traveling exhibit. It will have audio, and it's going to be these 8 collapsible panels with illustrations and text that will be free for loan to local schools and community organizations and things. So we're on track we should be ready to have the panels produced around the time spring semester ends, and then we hope in the early fall to have an unveiling of it. So knock on wood, as long as a safe or something doesn't fall on me, I think we should be good to go. So so thanks again, guys, for your time, and thank you.